Okay, so I think we probably should get started. Welcome. This is the LaRouche PAC Saturday evening class and discussion for March 4th. Thank you for joining us tonight. We've got, I think, a very intense and good discussion to have with Barbara Boyd. Let me just start out by saying that Trump is currently or just finishing up his speech at the CPAC conference outside Washington. He is stealing the show once again. Massive turnout for the straw poll, 62% in favor of Trump, 5 points higher than the last time they took it 6 months ago. And perhaps the biggest thing out of CPAC in terms of the polls was that Kari Lake was the #1 VP candidate. So DeSantis is just now, numero duo, not much of a showing. And of course, he's not there. He's down with a bunch of Club for No Growth donors in Florida. And in the speech, Trump was very clear. We are not going back to the party of Paul Ryan, Karl Rove, and Jeb Bush. We're just not doing it, to loud applause. There was also a strong 79% of the people, there's about 2,000 people there, and this is not MAGA. I mean, at least a lot of the speakers are not America First Trump type people or orientations. But the audience, maybe more so. 79% wanted to shut down the funding for this insane Ukraine war. But as everyone on this call tonight knows, this war is insane. Rick Grenell was interviewed and said he would have stopped it before it ever started. He said before it even happened, it was clear the Russians were about to invade. A peace agreement should have been found then because of the sanctity of human life. That's exactly the case to be made. That's a real diplomatic argument. That's the case Trump has made, and it's the case LaRouche PAC has made for a long time, that the way to do that is an orientation of rapid development and to make the American people self-conscious and self-aware of the kinds of political, cultural, and psychological operations that they're confronting. And I think Barbara Boyd's got a sense of that. There's been a number of leaks or reports from Twitter files that have started to document the level of censorship and persecution by the government, by the police state agencies, tied into private corporations. But no one knows that better than the Lyndon LaRouche operation, and Barbara Boyd has been in the legal office for many decades. So she's going to lay out a presentation and strategic assessment tonight, and then Tony Pappert will lead the discussion for questions. So Barbara, why don't you take it away and give us a sense of what you're thinking?
Okay, many of you who received the emails for this actually know that I'm in the middle of writing a true crime story. It's had several chapters so far on the LaRouche PAC website about what we can call the defamatory murder of Lyndon LaRouche. And by murder, I mean the use of state propaganda to induce such a state of hatred in the population for a personage that facts and reality cease to matter, and the social status of John Q. Public out there depends on adopting.
Yeah, thanks for introing her. Now you're going to have to bring me in now.
Hey,
Tony,
Tony, you're interrupting me.
As you did before.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Yeah, basically, that people out there subjected to these operations actually view their social status as being whether or not they actually adopt the visceral emotion which they think they have to have towards that person, perception of that person, which they have really no idea if you ask them, where did this come from, what's it's based on? And they react in exactly that fashion. You probably recognize that I'm talking about here the same type of psychological warfare operation which was deployed against Donald Trump from the time he descended the stairwell at Trump Tower in 2015, and from that date really forward. Now, there are aspects of this operation that are currently under investigation in the House of Representatives. A special subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee has been convened to examine the weaponization of the government. And they're modeling themselves on the 1970s Church Committee, they say. For those in our audience too young to know what the Church Committee was, in the late 1970s, as a result of the coup against President Richard Nixon by Henry Kissinger and other operatives of the oligarchy's Anglo-American secret government, and as a result of real revolts in the US intelligence community against a variety of crimes they were being asked to commit, many of the illegal operations of the secret government at that time were unveiled in the investigations of two congressional committees, the Church Committee in the Senate and the Pike Committee in the House. Following the Trilateral Commission reshaping of the US government during the Carter administration, which saw the first initial gutting of the US industrial economy, Ronald Reagan won the presidency in a landslide in 1980. And in the early months of the Reagan administration, a huge battle took place between the British faction of the CIA, which was then led by James J. Angleton, George H.W. Bush, and William Casey, and Reagan's, let's call them the California cabinet, the people who were the outsiders in Washington at that point of time, who'd been around Ronald Reagan through his governorship in California and going forward. Now, after Reagan was shot, George H.W. Bush, the vice president, largely succeeded in steering what we will call the British bankers' CIA to victory in that fight about the future course of the intelligence apparatus of the United States. Deputy CIA Director Bobby Ray Inman, for example, who opposed the return to British imperial ways, inclusive of the creation of a proposed special relationship to the Israeli intelligence services, was out by 1983. And Lyndon LaRouche had worked with Bobby Ray Inman in the course of working with the Reagan National Security Council in proposing what became the Strategic Defense Initiative, which I'll get into, and trying to get the Soviet Union to adopt that as a policy, which would have, at that point in time, literally created a vast revolution in economics, in science, which would have benefited all of mankind and ended the Cold War. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Now, this group, I'll call them the British faction of the CIA, led by the people I mentioned, claim that the Church and Pike Committee revelations had so severely crippled the CIA that it could no longer function and conduct the types of operations which they believed had actually benefited the United States. That's untrue, of course, because, you know, dating all the way back to the Roosevelt administration, with Franklin Roosevelt's death, the British were able to effectively begin to shepherd the United States into this special relationship and into the idea that British strategic objectives would be implemented in the world using so-called American brawn, i.e. our intelligence services, our military, etc., to achieve their strategic objectives. So what began to be put in place is the apparatus of the secret government, which we're now confronting. The first thing which was done was an executive order 12333, which covered covert intelligence operations, assuring once again that they would be kept secret forever, beginning in 1981. That executive order allowed and allows intelligence officials to lie to Congress and to the public about what are called sources and methods. And that same executive order allowed for massive privatization of all intelligence activities to private contractors and the outsourcing to allied foreign intelligence services of intelligence operations conducted by the United States. So as opposed to FISA surveillance authorities, for example, which you've heard so much about during the course of the coup against Donald Trump, the warrants on Carter Page and other people, that surveillance authority arose from the Church Committee investigations. But contrary to that, most of the operations against Trump were conducted not under FISA, but under Executive Order 12333 and remain classified under Executive Order 12333. That may shock you, but that's what began to be developed during this period of time. Executive Order 12333 also established the National Security Council as the coordination point for implementing covert operations emanating from the rest of the executive branch, for example, from the CIA, the National Security Agency, the military, the FBI, etc. This coordinating function is what is called the interagency, operating in many respects outside the president's purview that you heard so much about in President Trump's first impeachment trial. Next, in 1982, Bush et al. Implemented a policy under National Security Council Directive 77. And this policy allowed for the propaganda and psyop operations to achieve political objectives utilized in warfare, you know, things we have done in warfare previously under this rubric, to be directed for the first time at the American public. Shocking, but that's what actually happened beginning in 1982. NSD 77 also established the National Security Council as the coordinating point for these operations and created the administrative liaisons of the executive branch with the newly established National Endowment for Democracy. Now, what is that? What is the NED? Well, the NED was announced by President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in London in 1983. So we've got three new items here in terms of beginning to construct the national security state as we find it now. That National Endowment for Democracy formally took over many of the former regime change and formed subversion operations of the CIA. Under the rubric of the National Endowment for Democracy, you have incorporated the private sector, which was now a taking part in these intelligence operations, the Democratic and Republican parties, each of which have an institute with under the rubric of the National Endowment for Democracy, and the Congress itself, which is how the NED gets funded and how its operations are legislatively controlled. British intelligence specifically were completely incorporated, that's why Reagan and Thatcher announced it in London, into these operations. So you've got three prongs here of the modern national security state, the thing we need to dismantle. When you hear the idiot, our president, run around talking about democracy versus autocracy, what you're really hearing is his allegiance to this particular apparatus, the National Endowment for Democracy and Project Democracy, as it has evolved over the course of the last 40 years. The actual intention of all of these changes was to create effectively a corporatist state, a fascist corporatist state. And by that, I mean the incorporation of private enterprise, specifically large-scale multinational corporations with the state intelligence services, all essentially in the service of an international oligarchy, the modern British financial empire, as a gendarme, if you will, a regime protector, if you will, for keeping these guys in power and ensuring their security relationships throughout the world. So those were the three things which actually got built at that point in time. You'll recognize them at this point in time in terms of current events when you look at the disclosures which have been made by Elon Musk's intervention as to how Twitter and Silicon Valley has operated ever since really, the taking off of Google after the, .com collapse in the in the late 1980s. The key here in terms of how these covert powers get directed at somebody is legally they have to be designated that they're either an agent of a hostile power or they're violence-prone terrorists. Interesting in terms of thinking about the entire operation against Donald Trump to actually say that he was an agent of Putin, and interesting in terms of thinking about the current phase of calling all Trump supporters and similarly situated conservative individuals in the United States domestic terrorists. Now, if the surveillance and operational powers of this apparatus are invoked under 12333, the aim is not necessarily a criminal prosecution conducted pursuant to the rules of evidence and legal standards as destroyed as those currently are in our country. The goal is what is called neutralization of the target, making them ineffective. You can imagine what is done under this rubric. Everything from the types of defamatory operations which effectively create a hatred against the person politically and in his or her community, up to and including, in all probability, jailings, assassinations, druggings, etc. Since many of the techniques involved here are illegal, things learned from these operations were not supposed to be able to be used in criminal proceedings. And that was the case up until September 11, 2001, where it was decided that we had crippled ourselves, allegedly, in being able to detect, the Al-Qaeda terrorists in the United States by not sharing the information gathered under this 12333 rubric with criminal prosecutors. So that's no longer the case at this point. There are all sorts of ways in which evidence which is obtained illegally is laundered back into criminal proceedings for use which would otherwise be violative of the United States Constitution. Now, this structure has gone through many changes with key inflection points, as I just mentioned, on September 11, 2001, where we implemented the Patriot Act, where we began openly spying and mass surveillance programs on Americans, the 2008 financial crisis in the Obama administration, where Silicon Valley was really formally incorporated into this. People were profiled based on their social media profiles. There was talk and implementation within the Biden administration of actually using psychological warfare techniques to cause, quote unquote, cognitive dissonance in people who were expressing ideas which were felt by the security state to be dangerous. All of these things have evolved. But my point here in outlining this right now is that any investigation of the security state, the deep state, such as the one the Congress is now undertaking, will be incomplete or ineffective unless the actual history, the secret history of operations under these edicts as amended is fully explained and vetted to the American public. I'm going to detail in a subsequent class, I'm going to look at how this thing has evolved and, bring it right up to the present in terms of where we sit right now with the investigations that and what has been unveiled in the course of the coup against the 45th president of the United States. Obviously, the new technologies of social media have increased the effectiveness of these operations. They haven't altered the fundamental intent. I'll just give you an example. Matt Taibbi and others have recently discovered that the Global Engagement Center at the US State Department played a coordinating role in the government censorship campaigns conducted through Twitter, and that this role resulted from an executive order signed by Barack Obama. That much which he discovered is very true, but the citation he makes only tells a small part of the story. Obama's executive order actually authorizing the current operations superseded a previous executive order by Obama concerning these very same activities and the coordination of social media campaigns during the Arab Spring, in which the Obama administration overthrew many Arab governments. And also, it doesn't, actually include the fact that the previous executive order set up the NATO Strategic Communications Center in Latvia. And that center, in turn, run totally by British intelligence. All of these things are British, because that's where these types of techniques actually originated. NATO Strategic Communications Center in Latvia became the center of training all of the various Ukrainian social media operatives and propagandists, the likes of which are being inundated every single day now concerning how well the war in Ukraine is going, creating the popular image of, Zelensky as the modern hero, cowboy hero of the Western world, a modern Winston Churchill. These same operatives from Ukraine were used repeatedly, throughout the 2014 coup in Ukraine, and were used repeatedly in the coup against Trump right here in the United States. So that's really the topic of a sort of separate class to evolve this thing for you and bring it up to date. But, I must underline that all of this, results from, British intelligence operations, which have always emphasized mind control and propaganda as the, unique ability to win wars by subjugating whole populations. It evolves from techniques that came out of the Tavistock Institute, that came out of all sorts of things in Britain, which essentially have this mind control type of popular mind control type of political operation as their thesis. You might be reminded at this point that Cecil Rhodes, who is probably one of the most famous British operatives in history, noted in his will that the aim of all his scholarships in which we participate, and the aim of all soft power in Britain and through the City of London, was the preservation and enlargement, as he said, of the British way of life and the British Empire, and not uncoincidentally, the recapture of the United States of America. And that has been their goal ever since they lost the Civil War. So for this class, I'm going to sort of just give you a working idea of how this initial deep state operation functioned in the case of Lyndon LaRouche. On August 27th, 1982, a top secret letter was sent from the British government to the FBI. The letter itself remains classified to this day, but it's clear from the FBI's response to it and from its unclassified attachments and from subsequent actions what the British were demanding. On September 24th, 1982, under the subject heading Ray, Lyndon LaRouche, and the Executive Intelligence Review, FBI Counterintelligence Chief James Nolan responded to the British demands as follows. We would like to reiterate our conclusion that while many of the harassment activities of the NCLC and the themes promoted by NCLC publications are often propitious to Soviet disinformation and propaganda interests, there is no direct evidence that the Soviets are directing or funding LaRouche or his organization. It is entirely plausible, however, that the Soviets have developed or may be developing sources within the NCLC who are in a position to interject Soviet-inspired views into NCLC activities and publications. It is likely that the Soviets will attempt to capitalize on or exploit NCLC sentiments that are parallel to or promote Soviet foreign policy objectives. For your information, under the domestic security guidelines set forth by the Attorney General, the FBI does not have an active investigation of Lyndon LaRouche or the NCLC. So I'd like to just interject here something about James Nolan. He was a close personal friend of James J. Angleton, the former chief of CIA counterintelligence, who I'll talk about some more in a few minutes. Nolan and Angleton had the liaison relationship between the FBI and the CIA throughout the 1970s, and many writers, viewing the subsequent documentary history, believe that much of the responsibility for the FBI's infamous COINTELPRO activities against U.S. political groups and Martin Luther King rests not with J. Edgar Hoover, but with James J. Angleton. Both Hoover and Angleton were trained by the British intelligence services. In other words, they were not trained native to the United States. They were trained to become British intelligence operatives inside the United States through British training. Angleton was fired from the CIA because his mole hunts had seriously undermined any ability to conduct offensive intelligence against the Soviet Union. When Seymour Hersh revealed that the CIA had infiltrated and spied on the anti-war movement in the United States, and that Angleton had led that activity, it finally became possible to fire him from the CIA, although he had a rabid following within the British component of the agency. Subsequent to his firing, many have come to believe he was either a British or a Soviet agent based on the damage he caused to the actual work of intelligence at the CIA and his very close and intimate relationship and training by the British-Russian spy, Kim Philby. Now, at the time of this smear by the FBI, we don't have any evidence to investigate them, but here's what we'll say to please you and to actually get a 12333 investigation going, because we said what we said about the Soviets. Lyndon LaRouche was engaged in classified information on behalf of the Reagan National Security Council and the CIA. He was serving as a back channel in discussions with the Soviet government about the possibility of adopting the Strategic Defense Initiative, the defense against nuclear weapons utilizing new physical principles, namely laser and pulse technologies, advocated by Lyndon LaRouche and Dr. Edward Teller, and beloved by President Ronald Reagan. Henry Kissinger and other members of the arms control regime were aghast at LaRouche's presence in the White House and at the proposals he was making for an end to the MAD doctrine, the insane doctrine of mutually assured destruction, which keeps humanity persistently posed on the edge of thermonuclear warfare, as we are now. The opening to strategic defense, i.e. the ability to neuter incoming nuclear missiles, and its corollary promise of massive scientific breakthroughs and technological progress would have broken, at that point in time, the imperial economic British dominance of the world once and for all. Now, in subsequent court testimony by Richard Morris, a member of the Reagan California cabinet and an aide to National Security Advisor Judge William Clark, Morris named Ken de Graffenried, the author of EO 12333, Roy Godson, a British intelligence operative working directly for James J. Lovestone and James J. Angleton's labor networks. Godson was working for PIFIOB and the NSC at that point, and had lobbied for the adoption of Executive Order 12333. And Walter Raymond, the CIA man brought into the White House to implement NSD 77. Those three people, according to our friend Richard Morris, were leading a constant campaign against LaRouche and against being weapons inside the Reagan NSC. On August 19th, 1982, just days before the British letter to the FBI calling for LaRouche's head, Henry Kissinger had written to FBI Director William Webster demanding that LaRouche be investigated for, quote unquote, harassing Kissinger. That's the same Henry Kissinger who, in a speech at the Royal Institute for International Affairs on May 10th, 1982, had openly declared himself to be a British agent of influence. The same speech endorsed Churchill's rigid anti-Soviet policies and British colonialism over, quote, naive American idealists. Here's what Kissinger said about his service to the British while in US government in that speech. The British were so matter-of-factly helpful that they became a participant in internal American deliberations to a degree never before practiced between sovereign nations. In my period in office, the British played a seminal role in certain American bilateral negotiations with the Soviet Union. Indeed, they helped draft key documents. In my White House incarnation then, as National Security Advisor, I kept the British Foreign Office better informed and more closely engaged than I did the American State Department. That's pretty shocking. Now, what Kissinger calls harassment by LaRouche was LaRouche's widespread exposure of exactly this, the British agent aspect of his curriculum vitae. And we also went after Kissinger's 1974 document entitled NSSM 200, which called for drastic population reduction in the Third World by any means necessary in order to conserve raw materials for colonialist looting. We also examined Kissinger's role in the kidnapping and murder of Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro and of Ali Bhutto in Pakistan. That was the harassment which he was complaining about. Then on January 12, 1983, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, composed of David Absher, Leo Chern, and Edward Bennett Williams, demanded that an FBI investigation under Executive Order 12333 be opened on LaRouche based on harassment of Henry Kissinger and possible foreign funding, as they said, open this investigation under the Attorney General's guidelines or otherwise. Or otherwise. The or otherwise refers specifically to Executive Order 12333. The phony designation of possible foreign funding or being quote unquote propitious to Soviet propaganda interests triggered the operation against LaRouche, just like the phony Russiagate claims triggered them against Trump. On March 23, 1983, however, President Reagan shocked the world by announcing that the US would undertake a crash program to develop an anti-missile defense based on new beam technologies rather than old interceptor missiles. He offered to share these technologies with Soviets in a cooperative effort to end MAD and to make these technologies available to all countries. This was LaRouche's proposal, and unmistakably so. LaRouche had told the Soviets in his back channel negotiations that they could either accept the proposal or that the resulting scientific arms race set off by American implementation of the SDI would collapse their economy, an analysis which Lyndon LaRouche had done for the Reagan administration. And that's exactly what happened to the Soviets after they refused Reagan's offer. According to all of the subsequent accounts, the Pentagon, the State Department, and most of Reagan's cabinet were astounded and shocked at his SDI proposal. In April of 1983, a salon of journalists and government officials began meeting at the home of New York and London investment banker John Train to plan a series of murderous defamations of Lyndon LaRouche in order to break his ties to the Reagan administration and honest officials in the intelligence community, and to neutralize his ability to politically function, and ultimately to create the basis for a prosecution based upon a created public perception of LaRouche as public enemy number one, the very same techniques which have been deployed against Donald Trump. John Train emphasized in the meeting that allegations of KGB influence were to be utilized since they had a profound impact on the public, and nothing was to be written about LaRouche's actual political policies or his actual connections to the Reagan administration or the intelligence community. The Soviets themselves ruined Train's battle plan because they began a full-scale assault on LaRouche and the SDI. LaRouche's Soviet interlocutor in his back channel discussions, Yevgeny Shchershev, was ordered by the Russians to immediately return to Russia. In May of 1983, a Soviet delegation of 25, including many KGB agents, held a peace conference in Minneapolis with associates of Walter Mondale. The delegation was headed by Fyodor Berlatsky, a confidant of Mikhail Gorbachev, a journalist and a KGB publisher. The aim of the conference was to line up the Democratic Party to declare war on LaRouche and the SDI, which the Democrats then did. On August 10, 1983, Berlatsky, writing in the Soviet publications Literachina Gazeta, attacked the SDI as a cause for war, literally a casus belli. He repeated this claim in October of 1983, naming LaRouche specifically as the responsible party for the SDI. On November 4, 1983, LaRouche was again attacked in the Soviet government publication Izvestia. In my series on the Train Salon, which many of you received in an email, which is also posted on our website, I have outlined the pedigrees of those who were there, starting with John Train himself. He was an American Tory and a skilled propagandist who worked in various assignments for the intelligence community. He was a bagman for George H.W. Bush's CIA entities. Train's former partner, Thomas J. Devine, himself a former CIA employee, had partnered with George H.W. Bush in the Zapata Oil Company during Bush's time as an oilman in Texas. Many believed that Zapata was a CIA proprietary. Train himself was the former editor of the Congress of Cultural Freedom's Paris Review and was engaged at the time of his LaRouche salons in running black propaganda operations for the CIA against the Russians in the war in Afghanistan. Train's work in Afghanistan was coordinated from the National Security Council by Walter Raymond under NSDD 77. I will be exposing those who were there over the next few weeks on the red on the website, but to suffice it to say, most of the journalists who were there, from the Wall Street Journal, from Reader's Digest, from the New Republic, from Business Week, from NBC Television, were part of James J. Angleton's journalist network, a group not exposed in the infamous Operation Mockingbird Church Committee disclosures about journalists who were working covertly for the CIA throughout the entire corporate press at that point in time. Angleton's journalists were not exposed because he kept his network close and secret. The private organizations that participated were the most part longstanding quangos, i.e. proprietaries of the CIA and FBI, who were then associated with Project Democracy and the newly founded National Endowment for Democracy. They were, in one form or another, and this becomes somewhat fascinating, the heirs of the Bukharinite labor movement, control of ex-communists who were Bukharianites, led by Jay Lovestone and James J. Angleton at the CIA, who funded Jay Lovestone's labor operations. The financing for the main diatribe against LaRouche, written by former Progressive Labor Party member Dennis King, was arranged at the train meetings. It came from the Social Democratic League for Industrial Democracy and from the Smith-Richardson Foundation, a longstanding financier of CIA projects. Throughout 1984 through 1986, the official Soviet press and the veterans of the train salon engaged in a concentrated series of wild defamations of LaRouche, painting him as an unhedged terrorist, a dedicated fascist, the leader of violence-prone cult, while repeatedly calling for his prosecution. The slanders and defamations were set up in such a way as to continue the operations under 12333. That is, that they were what we like to call in the trade ID format slanders, which create government investigations. Nothing was to be printed or said about his actual policies. In March of 1986, when two LaRouche associates won Democratic Party primaries in Illinois, the defamations became a virtual avalanche, hitting every single publication in the United States. I used to keep boxes of them for the legal cases. And literally, every single day from March of 1986 through October of 1986, there would appear in one form or another, yet another one of these wild and insane characterizations of Lyndon LaRouche, creating exactly the hateful image which they were designed to create. In October of 1986, a raid by 400 armed FBI and Virginia State Police agents visited LaRouche's residence and his associates' corporate offices in Leesburg, Virginia, kicking off the prosecution. Later admissions by Loudoun County Sheriff's Deputy Donald Moore to an FBI informant working on another case demonstrated that the raid itself had an ancillary operational purpose of taking LaRouche out, similar to Ruby Ridge and the takedown subsequently of David Koresh in Waco. So that's where I'm going to leave it. It tells you how this was done to LaRouche. It shows you the pillars of the current national security state. And I think it effectively argues why, when you dismantle this thing, you've got to go to the heart of the operation and you've got to have the secret history entirely revealed. So that's where I'll leave it at this point and open it up for questions.